Thank you for joining us for Global Network Connect. I'm Ben Madison at the Yale School of Management. Today on Global Network Connect, we'll be talking about the future of work, how things like our jobs and our working lives will be changed in the coming decades by artificial intelligence, robotics, the rise of the gig economy, globalization, income inequality, and more. I'm joined by four experts from schools in the Global Network for Advanced Management: Avigdor Gal, professor in the Faculty of Industrial Engineering and Management at Technion, Israel Institute of Technology; Jennifer Jordan, professor of Leadership and Organizational Behavior at IMD in Lausanne, Switzerland; Raul Montalvo, director of IGADE Business School, Guadalajara in Mexico; and Frank Ojadi, research director at Lagos Business School in Nigeria. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. And thanks to everyone who has already submitted questions. You can submit questions during the hour by clicking the Q&A button in Zoom, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can later in the hour. I'm going to start by asking a few questions of our panelists. Avigdor, we'll start with you. So there's a lot of discussion about jobs being lost to AI in the coming decades, maybe even many jobs. What kinds of jobs do you think are going to be lost to AI, and what kind of jobs will still require a human being?
Okay, thank you for this question. So broadly speaking, job loss due to technology may be the result of one of three possible changes. The first, when a product simply ceases to exist, the support of this product disappears. For example, when videos were no longer the main vehicle of watching movies, companies like Blockbuster went out of business along with their employees. The other aspect may be when technology changes and some jobs may become redundant. So for example, when electricity became a widespread technology, gas street lamps were replaced by electric street lamps, and as a result, there was no longer a need for lamplighters. The third one is when technology takes over, and then humans that perform the same job are simply left unemployed. In this, for example, when the car takes over driving, then taxi and truck drivers are expected to lose their jobs. Also, when self-checkout penetrate supermarkets, cashiers are laid off. So there seems to be a bit of the three in each job loss, but there is typically a leading factor. Affected by various science fiction movies and series, we seem to be mostly concerned about technology taking over our jobs, possibly trapping us and enslaving us to perform something for the machine in return. When we look into jobs that were invented recently, say in the last decade, we also see the same separation. So Zumba was invented and now calls for Zumba instructors. Social media changed marketing, requiring position of a social media manager. And autonomous driving all of a sudden requires a new position of autonomous driving engineers. So all in all, we have these three different elements, and to face the future job market, we should prepare ourselves to frequently make decisions regarding our future using knowledge of technology changes. So continuous skill development and continuous education becomes a key factor in that. And just as a last final comment, in the Talmud, it is said that since the temple was destroyed, prophecy has been taken away from prophets and given to fools. So I will try not to be the fool here. I will risk the following and argue that one of the human jobs that will disappear and will become machine jobs will be that of job consultancy. Thank you. Ben, you're on mute. We cannot hear you, sorry.
Thank you. Before we move on, I want to welcome Maeve Houlihan from University of College Dublin, Lochlann Quinn School of Business in Ireland. Maeve, thanks so much for joining us. Does someone want to respond to Avigdor's comments about AI? So let's move on to another related question for Jennifer. And Jennifer, I think you've written about this question of what AI means specifically for leaders like the people that we train at our business schools here in the Global Network. Is it going to take away the roles of MBAs anytime soon?
Well, it's assuming that most of our MBAs become leaders and not managers, which is a whole nother issue. But you're asking about leadership in AI, and you're absolutely right. My colleagues and I have written about this for HBR. But so you can think about leader skills being divided into the hard skills. Let's say that's like data analysis, and then the soft skills as well. So we could say something like giving feedback to a colleague or a subordinate. And then we can think about tasks that leaders do that combine the two. So for example, looking at an employee's records for the last 5 years and looking at the data, maybe even the KPIs or the sales numbers they brought in, and then from that, giving meaningful feedback. So you're combining the soft and the hard skills. Now, clearly, AI has started to take over the hard skills. We see more and more AI machine learning doing the data analysis, data mining. Now, the question is, right now, the soft skills are still practically in the domain of humans. And I say practically because it's not necessarily scientifically. So here's an example. I've done quite a bit of work in emotional intelligence and also being able to read people's nonverbal behavior and also lie detection. And if you had asked me 7 to 10 years ago, is this something clearly in the human domain, I would say yes. There's no way that a machine or a robot could detect people's lying the way the best experts could, or understand their nonverbal behavior and decipher it and understand what it means. But that is starting to change. So we see now that, for example, there's programs using Google Glasses that can look at people's nonverbal behavior and actually decipher their emotions far better and more accurately than any human expert alive can do. There's another program where people stand on a platform and you can see based on the way that their weight shifts, whether or not you can predict if they're lying or being truthful. Same with looking at their retinas, right? So technology is actually starting to replace human behavior or human abilities in what we would typically call the soft domains. But these aren't in practical ways. So for example, in a conversation with a business counterpart, we're not going to sit across from them wearing Google Glasses or ask them to sit on a platform where we're measuring their weight, right? So right now, this is still practically in the human domain. But I think that's only a matter of time before that shifts. And we are starting to see AI being an expert or replacing humans in some of these soft skills as well. So I think we do have to, number one, be as leaders, or tell our leaders if we're at business schools, to constantly be thinking about how do you update these these softer skills that are needed for leaders and are right now in the human domain, and what are machines starting to take over, but also what are machines able to support. Now, what we still know about machine learning, even the best machine learning or AI, is that it is very domain specific. So for example, the program that beat Garry Kasparov at chess would not be able to play Go. It can only play chess. And in a world of, in a VUCA world, we always say that things are more uncertain and disruptive and changing. Human beings are able to cross domains, which machines still haven't been able to do very well. So I would say also the ability to be agile is in the human domain and is in the leadership domain. But again, I'm not going to predict what the future looks like in terms of what AI is able to do.
Thank you. Maeve, let's move to you. And I think one change that seems to be coming is a movement away from steady work and a movement toward gig work, project work. Will that become the dominant form? Will people like me be hired for projects instead of being an employee of Yale University, which I like? And what does that mean? Do we need new support systems to allow for, vacations, to allow for the information to be efficiently pass through an organization when people are not working full time. Oh,
I'm on mute. There I am now. Can you hear me okay?
yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So they're such great questions, aren't they? And, you know, picking up, I think, on what Jennifer has said, I think there's a great seduction in and currency in agility, you know, and we're very attracted, I think, to the idea of meaningful work, being work that we feel we're making an active contribution and that we have some autonomy over and some control over, and that we're growing as people. So those are our kind of motivators as human beings. And at times of our life, you know, the idea of being a gig worker is very attractive because it suits us and we've got energy for it, and it gives us this feeling of mastery and certainly control over what's possible and when. And for organizations, of course, organizations are very attracted to the idea of the agility that's possible through having a very flexible organization. You know, 20 years ago, we were talking about that as, I think Charles Handy coined the phrase the Shamrock organization, and he had a sort of an image of a core and a periphery and a technical specialist group. And I think what we've seen is that has, you know, that was insightful 20 years ago. It didn't seem like it seemed like it would be more specialist, but now it's very widespread. And so right across the, I suppose, employment domains, you know, from very routine work to very high scale professional work, we're seeing people in gig economies. And one of the, I suppose, research teams that has always inspired me is Gideon Kunda and Steve Barley, you know, and their work on, I suppose, hard guns and the consultants and the technical experts and that whole field. And for those individuals and consultants in general, there's great, you know, there's great opportunity to go into organizations, influence and leave and not be tied to the politics. And those sort of specialists really protect themselves sometimes by forming alliances and groups. But, you know, throughout, whether it's that type of person or whether it's the person who's picking up extra work, maybe delivering or driving for Uber, we begin to see the shift, I suppose. The question was always about the risk going outside the organization to the individual. And certainly it does. But my observation would be that actually the risk also goes right back into the organization again, because what we begin to threaten when we very much rely on the gig worker, the outsourced worker, or the temporary worker, the project worker, is we begin to threaten that that what I would call, my colleague and I have talked about as a thick relationship with our colleagues, where you have long knowledge and deep knowledge and a kind of a sense of mutuality over time about give and take, about catching something now, staying late, doing an extra piece on the project, now knowing that it'll come back to you later. So, you know, there's a couple of things going on there, I suppose, that we need to think of, and they're mainly to do with short-term and long-term. But your core question was, is there going to be more of this? And I think undoubtedly in our times, given the strong, I suppose, the strong inscribing of work with technology, the capacity to work at a distance, the capacity to work at all different times, there's no question but that there's going to be more gig work.
Can I add something very quickly to that, Ben?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So thank you, Maeve. So also to add to that, I do quite a bit of work on how the future of work is changing with changing generations as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when I talk about millennials in the classroom, a lot of executives roll their eyes and they say, well, it's just us when we were younger. Yes and no. If you look at surveys of young employees 2 decades ago or generations ago, one of the first criteria they had for their first job was stability or the ability to grow with a company. And now millennials are not valuing that. They want to reach their own personal goals and they want to have more work-life balance. And so we see that millennials are actually looking for something different than previous generations. And this ability to meet one's own goals, to have more work-life balance, that goes along with the gig economy. Also, you can move around the world doing what you want to do, and the mobile workplace is becoming more realistic as well. So to support what Maeve said, I would absolutely agree that the gig economy is a reality. And with changing generation, first the millennials, and then we'll see how Generation Z thinks about it, it is absolutely a reality.
Great, thank you. Frank, I want to ask you about some of the economic aspects of the future economy, the future world of work, and in particular, how you expect globalization to continue to change work. Globalization has led to a lot of job losses in some countries and job gains in other countries over the last 20 years. Do you expect global supply chains for supply chains to continue to become more globalized, and what effect does that have on work?
Yeah. I really think supply chains, I really think that supply chains really will continue to be more global, given the fact that a lot of typically, when you look at it, a very simple, uncomplicated supply chain, it really involves perhaps one of a few companies coming together and getting involved in the movement of things, from movement of materials, information, and money, one point to the other. And therefore, as globalization picked up in the past 3 decades, it has led to quite a lot of complicated supply chains coming largely from the desire to really seek out efficient production locations or where to really expand your market. Now, what that meant, 2 key things have played a key role in this complicated global supply chains. And these are essentially technology in the transportation area and also in information management. Now, if you look at the typical global supply chain, it comprises quite a lot of stakeholders and actors. And all these actors tend to work in their own silos. But with the advent of technology coming up and having digital activities coming up in this space, where you're now looking at digital supply chains, you're beginning to see quite a lot of jobs in these areas being lost to technology. I'm talking of a typical example of what's going to happen in the future and what is probably happening now, in the sense that you're now beginning to see that if you take the thing of movement of vessels from one point to the other, it started first by having quite a lot of gang labor in the process. And of course, this gang labor has gradually disappeared with the advent of containerization that came up. Now we're going to see a lot more of that happening, particularly now that we're beginning to see some smart containers coming into the space. And what that means, it's simply that these containers can now be monitored from anywhere using cloud technology or digital systems or devices that have been put in place. So this invariably will impact on the kind of jobs associated with container movement. And of course, we will now begin to see what I call a lot more globalized supply chain. In other words, should be looking at digital supply chain taking the center stage and going on to impact on the way things come. An interesting example that we have seen in our environment is simply that a typical manufacturer that really ships most of its products to different clients beyond Africa and also within Africa. We have a warehouse where you have quite a lot of manual labor going on now, but a robot has taken up this position. And this robot works with such a precision that it doesn't really miss the loading of trucks. Now, naturally, those laborers no longer have any work left. And we see a couple of these things happen. Now, in our own environment, where you have quite a lot of human interactions in the course of getting things moved from one point to the other, the digitization of the processes, the information management and using cloud computing, they are kind of crowding away these fellows. They no longer need them. So one thing becomes very clear. If you really want to operate in this space, you now need to begin to think of scaling and retooling and beginning to understand exactly how to program most of those technologies or manage most of those processes to be able to remain relevant in this space. So certainly, we're going to see quite a significant change in the nature of work that we're making in the global arena as far as the supply chain is concerned. Now, the other interesting feature that comes to mind is simply that most of the countries in the sub-Saharan Africa and indeed other parts of the world that are kind of really worried regarding what's going to happen if we allow this global supply chain or globalization of the supply chain to continue. They're kind of fighting back by way of being concerned as to what's going to happen if things are made in different climes and are now brought into the country and they are now posed to compete against locally made products. We're now beginning to see a situation of concern, and I won't be surprised if governments come up with some kind of protectionism to try to drive and maintain the way things are done locally. But certainly these changes are going to come.
Wonderful, thank you. Does anyone want to jump in before I ask another question? Thank you. Raul, let me ask you this question. Should we expect a change in how much of the population is actually working? I think in the West that percentage has already been going down with more robotics, more AI. Should we expect simply that there are fewer people working, and would that mean more time for leisure? Would that mean more people struggling economically? Do we need something like a universal basic income in the future world of work?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And there is, of course, things that are rebalancing, and many things are changing. And in some sectors, because that's important to say, it's different sectors, differences across countries, regions. And yes, we have to expect that there is a new composition of the time. What we have been observing in many cases is that freelancers are growing quite fast. And non-freelancers, all those people that are being employed in a company, are going down. And this is also something that we can link with the generations. My millennials, of course, tend to be more willing, as Jennifer was saying before, for work to get better life balance. And yes, we expect in the next decade, actually, freelancers are going to overtake non-freelancers. What they're looking for is for more freedom, more flexibility to own their own time. And so we're going to expect some differences. Talking about universal income, I am not so convinced yet. And because of course it's a matter of skills, of course it's a matter of different knowledges. What has been told before is, yes, now we need to be more flexible in terms of what do we know, what do we learn, because it's a combination of hard skills with soft skills, and that's going to be very, very important. Yes, we can see industries. We have seen some processes that are under a lot of automation, and Amazon distribution centers, some car factories as well, where you see almost non-person working on it. So it's very interesting because, yes, there is some people behind it, behind some processes, behind some designs, behind some programming, but they have more time for sure, for leisure. But also we have to understand what leisure implies, because if some people is moving more towards having more leisure, that means we need to develop or to overcome with new industries or with new ideas in order to provide all these people with this. And yes, many jobs have been lost, but many others have been created. in the last times. So it's important to understand every single stage per sector in order to give us an idea of what stages are we at and what is the forecast for each one of them.
Thank you. I want to ask a question that I've seen from a number of our audience members, and I want to remind the audience that you can submit questions using the Q&A button on your screen. A number of you submitted questions while you were registering. Thank you very much. And here's a question that more than one person asked, and it's simply something that you've already referred to. What kinds of skills will people need to develop in the coming decades in order to stay employed and contribute, and how are those skills different from what we have now? Avigdor, can we? Do you have a thought about that question?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I think it's people will need to become more agile in their education and to move along with development of technology, because right now, as was mentioned before, we do see limitations of AI and algorithms. They are not easily generalized. They have, as soon as they learn a certain domain, it becomes harder to transfer that into other domains. But this will improve with years. And as soon as you give an assignment to a machine, with enough engineering, it will be able to take over human jobs. And that means that humans need to shift as well. And that involves two parts. One is to understand where to shift your attention. And the other one is where to get the right education for that. So people will have to be sure that they have continuous educations. Universities will have to develop to provide this type of education. And there will need to be some consultants, may there be humans or machines, to direct the whole population in the right directions.
Yeah.
Raul, any skills?
Yeah, definitely, and I agree with Avigdor. And it's important for education to change all the mindset. We need to educate more towards creation, creativity, ideation, and yes, in many sectors, of course, is all these cognitive analytical techniques are very important to develop in people. And now we talk a lot about design and also about soft skills such as emotional intelligence, resilience. All these kind of things is going to be very important. Many jobs are going to be lost, yeah, but many others, as we said before, they're going to be created.
Maeve, I think you had a thought.
Well, I think one of the interesting things, so absolutely, and people talk about them as the 5 C's or the 7 C's, the creativity, critical thinking, and a kind of cross-cultural intelligence as well. But one of the things I'm really interested in is learning really good self-management and boundary skills, because actually when you're completely trading on the here and now in the gig economy, then you kind of are under huge pressure to take the work when it comes. And you know that your reputation is based on the saying yes and the availability. And so what I have seen, and many of us have written about this, is the pressure then that can come on people to really work almost beyond their capacities, saving for tomorrow, if you like, in perhaps changed circumstances. And that's the transfer of risk. But actually, that's not going to work long term. It's not a very sustainable existence. And so these sustainable strategies, I guess, they sit amongst the skills that Avigdor was just speaking about, across resilience and judgment and discernment. And I think we really have to help our students, our colleagues, and ourselves become quite boundary orientated in a boundaryless world. And one of the things that's interesting is, I suppose, that classically consultants and professions have been very good at putting up those professional boundaries. That has given them a sort of an authority and an exclusivity, we've taken down all those boundaries. That's part of what we like about the frictionless economy, but actually it has some human challenges that we need to think about.
That leads really nicely into a question, another question from the audience, one of our student from Souder asked, for examples of courses or teaching approaches that schools in the global network are employing. Do any of you have examples of new courses at your institutions that are aimed at teaching leaders for this kind of a world?
Can I jump in there?
Please.
So we do have a week here at IMD where our MBAs work on things like Python programming, and they learn about AI and machine learning. And also, though, getting to what Maeve said, we have a clear, the leadership track is very much around resilience and drawing boundaries, and also about preventing burnout and understanding what one's limits are. Because I absolutely agree with Maeve that in a world where everything is faster and you do feel like you're on more, right? So I think the question that Raul talked about with leisure, our ideas it depends, even I wouldn't say the Western world because it also differs within Europe, but the idea of what leisure is and is not is changing. So people would say now, okay, I'm on vacation, or many people would say that, but yet they're still accessible 24/7. They might be checking their email, etc. So how do you know when you have reached your limit, when you're close to burnout? And we focus on that. So we have the hard skills that we try to instill in our MBAs, but also the soft skills that are more important in this VUCA world. And so each MBA has their own leadership coach, but they also have a psychoanalyst that they're paired with for the year where they can talk about some of these issues.
Jennifer, can you, for our audience, can you define VUCA? I think a couple of people have made reference to it.
Yeah, volatile, uncertain, I want to say chaotic, but it's not chaotic. So
complex. And ambiguous.
Complex and ambiguous, yes. Complex and ambiguous.
Yeah.
Chaotic, complex, yeah. Thank you. Yes, good point. Thanks, Ben.
Other courses or approaches?
Yeah, of course. Now we try to link things in terms of business intelligence and what does it implies for everybody, and together with how is it that businesses are reshaping and what does it involve, and it's very important, and this is something that Jen brought up, and I think that's good to say. And now with these dashboards that we create for decision making, they're accessible from everywhere, and so it doesn't matter where you are. I completely agree on that. And the other thing is critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and all these kind of things, because you have to find the balance in terms of this. And what you say you have to is everybody from leadership to all the people involved in management, and all the people involved in the companies and decision making and operation and everything.
Yeah, can I make add a few things to this?
Please.
Yeah, what comes to mind sometimes when we look at these things is the fact that it does appear to me that we tend to focus more on the high level, what I'll call the higher educational levels of MBAs and those who have first degrees and stuff. But what really bothers me a lot is what's going to happen to those guys that haven't had a chance to get to this level. I'll give an example. These days we have smart cars and Jeeps and all that in our environment. A lot of these guys who used to fix the carburetor kind of vehicles can no longer attempt to really fix these other smart vehicles. And what that means is instant loss of job, because you won't even get any means of really making a living. And they don't even have a chance to really begin to retool and learn new things, because they're not really in a position to do that. And therefore, the question then becomes, how are we going to really address this situation and then take it off from what I call from the grassroots level. People are coming out, going into lower junior schools and coming up and so on. And a good number of them are still coming up without very good, adequate STEM skills. And they're essentially going to get into this same world that we're now pushing up, asking for critical thinking, learning skills, into artificial learning, being able to really understand what these high-tech things are and be able to program and manage them. Where does that take us to? How are we going to really address that? Because I see that more as a time bomb. If you don't have a space for these guys to operate and scale, and perhaps learn new things, and be able to fit into this age that we're advancing into, then it probably will be some kind of a big challenge to several organizations that are out there moving really rapidly and embracing the artificial intelligence, embracing the Industry 4 stuff.
Thank you. I'm gonna give you a question. Oh, sorry, please.
Well, I was just going to comment, Frank. You know, I think it's so interesting that we're speaking across all these different continents, and yet the conversation about the future of work has been very singular. It's a very sort of consensus based sort of view, and that we're all going in this one direction, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. But at the same time, there's other nuances, and you've said it yourself. I think, Frank, that I suppose we're seeing nations, potentially move faster, learn from the generations previously. And, I'm really interested by how smart that will be. And I'm I think it's very exciting. You asked previously, Ben, about courses, and I think it's so exciting for our students to take opportunities to go and spend a week in a very different culture to their own, to really check out and understand the world from elsewhere to themselves. So it's just simply to say that, I do think that we have, I do think that we have to be cautious about a very convergent view of the future, because of course it's unwritten, and there's a lot of VUCA reasons why it won't be a straightforward narrative at all. But if we have the people here and the perspectives, I think, to get underneath that a bit.
Well put. I have a question from the audience. Avigdor, maybe you can help with this. Asking about the role of translation technologies in our future work. And I think, this is something that has improved quickly and maybe has the opportunity to really be transformational if it continues to improve.
So translation belongs to one of those anecdotal successes that you may say that the AI actually had. It was something that was considered for many years to be like a natural skill of humans, something that machines will be very hard at work to be able to do this type of translation. And it turns out that if you give the machine enough examples, it will be able to catch up. So it's a little bit remind me of many of those science fiction movies where you see those universal translators that allows people to communicate. I would like to take it to a little bit different area. I think that we are missing one partner, big partner here, both in our discussion and in the future work world, and these are the robots. So instead of just talking to each other, most works in the future will actually involve the relationship between humans and some kind of robots. And these don't have to be those robots that walk around us. They can be those cameras that oversee whatever we do and every now and then give us instructions. So we know that we can get instructions about turning the lights on and off and so on. And we can converse with Alexa on various things, still not at the very good level of communication, but this will come so much better over time. And that relates back to the previous questions about what type of skills we actually need to teach students. And one of those skills will be how to effectively communicate with machines, with robots, in order to become more productive.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Do you think a 40-hour work week is justifiable? Raul, maybe you can tackle that one. And I guess I would add, you know, for whom, whether it's the worker or the employee, whether the 40-hour work week still makes sense.
Well, I think that's a very important question. I have seen some companies, they have no working hours as the ones we know. And you can stop by at 3 a.m. in the morning. You can go home whenever you want. And that's a point. Probably is less than that, or is probably more than that. And it's important then to understand that now many companies are working toward task on time, rather than saying you are going to work for a particular time, length of time. And one thing which is also important for us to mention is that it's now the time for people to understand what is it that the company or the processes or the team is expecting out from them and when. And this is one kind of the things that we need to bring into the discussion. So now it's time for the companies to redesign positions, to redesign what they do, the deliveries, and the time framework for work. Because many of the manual routine processes, many of them are already made by robots. Not everywhere, as you were mentioning before. And there are different situations across sectors, across countries, but it's important also to picture what is it that we can expect. And also the companies, they are exporting the know-hows and exporting the technologies and exporting also differences in terms of management. So one of the things that we need to bring into the picture is what's going to happen regarding this redesign.
Jennifer, let me ask you a question from an audience member.
Sure.
We hear many buzzwords like blockchain, autonomous driving, cloud tech. What's a good tenet or basis to decide which of the many new trends to focus one's continuous education efforts in?
Mm-hmm.
There's a cost and time involved in learning each of those things.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. It's actually one that I've asked myself, because we're even seeing within executive education, where IMD is located, more and more AI, not blockchain so much, but AI certainly having a role, and technology having a role in how education is delivered. So I've asked that of myself. I think it depends a lot on where you see your skills and your talent and your future. So let me take, for example, the world of medicine, right? Medicine is absolutely being changed by robotics. And so it's not saying that no longer are we going to need doctors, but rather the way that that doctors deliver medicine is going to change. So I think for me, there's certainly, and maybe in a year, my answer will change as things change rapidly. But the question is the same as it always would be. Where does your passion lie? I don't think you should just acquire skills for the sake of acquiring skills, but where does your passion lie? Is it in law or medicine or some other domain? And then where do you see, to research, where do you see the future of that profession going? Is it in AI? Is it in robotics, etc.? I mean, I think getting back to Raul's question about the 40-hour work week, if we look at, for example, a doctor, we're starting to understand more that an 80-hour work week, which is normal for many physicians' careers, is no longer optimal from a psychological standpoint, that humans cannot make decisions as well when they're sleep deprived, and we understand more and more of that. But then how is robotics going to play a role? Are we going to still be able to deliver the amount of medicine as our population grows that we need through robotics? So can a doctor at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Switzerland program a robot in Morocco to do a surgery that will happen in 5 hours? And that is getting to be more and more the reality. So I guess I would get back to what I said originally. For everybody, I would still say, as a psychologist that looks at occupation and occupation development, look at what you're passionate at, and also see where that field is going. And there's many options. Blockchain, especially in the financial industry, in the shipping industry, blockchain is becoming more and more relevant within medicine, robotics, within law, AI or machine learning, and within education also. AI and machine learning is quite relevant.
Great.
Can I just jump in here?
Please.
So I want to propose a model where instead of working 40 hours a week, actually each one of us will work 24/7. So obviously this is something that it's impossible to do for humans, but imagine a situation where we have a robotic extension of ourselves. So some kind of an algorithm that learns what we do on our job. And when we're offline, that robot kicks in and assists, provides the work that we do, at least some of it, that can be done offline. So for example, for myself, when I go to sleep, obviously some of my students are still awake. They may have some questions for me. And some of the questions are very easy to answer. For example, can I come to your office tomorrow at whatever? And some may be more complex. So if we leave a trace, kind of a robotic trace behind us that will keep on working while we are asleep, we can actually create a situation that we're continuous working while, leaving the world behind at some point. So that's one comment. And another comment to the question that was asked, and the one part of the comment was that it's impossible to learn quickly everything. And for that, I might say, as the joke goes, is that I don't have to learn to be the quickest to learn. I just need to be quicker than others. So, and that connects well to, you have to connect to your passion. You have to develop, you keep on moving from one gig to the other, from one job to the other. You need to develop some kind of a core where you become better than others, and then simply apply this core to the next job that you're going to take on.
That's a great point. So just to thank you, Avigdor. And that's already the basis. What he said is, can we do our profession 5 hours of the day and then set a robot to finish up our work? That's already, I guess, what you would say machine learning is based upon, right? You give it training data, which a lot of it is collected by human beings, and then you say to the machine, what can you learn while I'm away from this data that you're feeding in? And of course, that's not perfect. We see that because of that, machine learning / AI also has the ability to propagate human biases that we have in our own data collection. But certainly that is very reasonable. And we even see that in, for example, a simple profession or an example as hospitality workers in hotels. They're now using robots, for example, to do a lot of the vacuuming work when they leave. They set the machine can learn the layout of the hotel, and then they set the robots to clean when they're away. So we're already starting to see some of that.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to turn to a question or two about whether this will be a positive change in the coming decades. So let me ask sort of two paired questions. One is just, should we be afraid of the changes to come, and then also, how can we be sure that the gains from the efficiencies that we're talking about are spread equally? Frank, can you start with this one?
I think there is this anxiety all over the place. regarding these changes in the nature of work as we move towards this, as we embrace the Industry 4. And I think very strongly that the anxiety is really growing by the day. But more importantly, it's really for organizations and also those that are in very key in the academia as well to perhaps begin now, as I have seen it happen, to begin to look at the various sectors and the various industries and try and figure out and ask the key questions. How would this impact? How would this impact on our organization going forward? And to what extent can we really begin to take control of this? And then the other one is the communication aspect of it. As you really engage and then try and find out exactly how this might impact your organization, you also begin to come up with the appropriate communication to try to get the workforce and indeed everybody in that space get to understand that these changes are really inevitable. But it's not going to come in one swoop. It will come in stages based on how it impacts on the different environments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Raul.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something new. We have seen it before. When the Industrial Revolution happened, it was not necessarily the same talk, but some of the same worries, how many jobs are going to be lost, etc. It's a matter of adapting to every single stage. As we were saying before, yes, some jobs are going to get lost, some others are going to be created. And every single thing that we do in terms of processes is an opportunity as well to create something new. That's why we've been talking about creativity, resilience, and all these things. And as it has been mentioned before, yeah, I mean, while I'm outside, I'm at the office probably, I have a vacuum robot in my place, and that vacuum robot is working for me. But at the same time, probably is checking on all the space and is bringing some new information about many other things. And that information can be used, that data can be used by other companies. And that's what we do, even when we are under leisure time, we are creating this information and someone else is gonna use it. So it's very interesting what we can do right now in order to create consumption patterns, in order to create some other things that are going to help hospitality industry and some other industries in order to come up with some new ideas in terms of new business models, in terms of new business opportunities.
Maeve, do you have thoughts about how to make sure that the gains are distributed in an equitable way?
Yeah, it is challenging. I worry sort of. There is a fair bit of research looking at the job losses may be a little gendered. We might expect, for instance, in this revolution, if we saw male employment really affected by, if you like, the service revolution, that we might see women really badly affected at this phase, particularly at the more routine areas of work. Of course, we'd like to free people up from routine and boring work. But at the same time, occupations and jobs mean communities. So I think that we just really need to hold on to our humanness as the pace picks up and realize that in the end, there are natural limits to everything that's possible. There's 24 hours in a day. There is a planet that, is struggling beneath the weight of our accelerating industrialization. And I suppose those are big ideas, but the one hope I have, and I do feel optimistic about the future, is that actually we'll be a lot more freed up to concentrate on the human and the environmental sustainability issues. That's really our next challenge.
Jennifer, were you going to chime in before?
Yes, something quickly about your first question. You said, should we be afraid? Well, as a psychologist, I would say yes, but not for too long. So what I see at least in the clients that come through at IMD, you need a little bit of fear of the future, a little bit of feeling of threat to get people moving. I mean, fear is a very interesting emotion. It really, it's what it's the movement emotion. It gets us activated. It gets us pursuing something. But if you're afraid for too long, it's actually quite destructive. So it even starts to destroy the immune system for people that are under fear of threat too long. So I would say, yes, you need to see some threat in the future that gets you moving, gets you going. But then that fear needs to be quickly replaced with what Maeve talked about as this hope. And also a vision, and this is where leadership comes in, right? As a leader, are you painting that vision for your employees of saying, yes, we are under threat, but then what is the vision for where we're going to go and how we're going to combat, or we're going to strategically deal with some of the changes that are happening in our industry? As a leader, are you able to create that vision? So I would say, yes, you need to be afraid, but don't stay afraid for too long.
Okay. Let me ask one last question, I think for a lot of us, the last decade or two have been kind of extraordinary in the scale of change. Looking forward into the next 2 decades, do you expect the scale of change to be even more so? And you know, what do you think is the biggest change in 20 years that we'll look back and say, oh yes, that was very different back in 2019? Raul?
Yeah, one of the things is that we are going to work, and we are not going to, we are already working next to a machine, whatever device it is. And yes, we need to understand what is our role and how we can adapt to that in terms of everything, in terms of manual jobs, in terms of decision making, in terms of everything. Right now, we can process such a big amount of information. And before, probably I was devoting a lot of time for research, and now it's faster. And the evolution is very, very fast, and it's going to change in the next decade. And not to say in the next 2 decades, we are going to see a very more rapid evolution that we have seen before. And we need to be aware, we need to be ready, and to be able to adapt to it. And also in terms of the technology, many of these things, talking about AI, IoT, and everything that we have seen now in the homes, for instance, the smart homes. Now, yes, we are becoming less patient because many things are more accessible for us. And I can perform 2, 3, or 4, or 5 tasks at the same time. And I can be preparing my coffee, I can be listening to the news, and with all these devices, with AI, and that they can do it for me. And I can switch on the laundry machine. It's very interesting, all these things that we have been doing and we are doing right now. We can have this dashboard, and we can have it in the bedroom. We can be talking to people, and this is something really interesting for us to do. So this is what we can expect.
So we have just about a minute to go. Does anyone else have a quick response for, in 20 years, the change that will seem obvious in retrospect?
One of the things I'm really excited about is the generations. And I think this year and the last few years have really shown us that the rising generations, you know, are equal, and we're very hooked on status. And they have been able to cut through a lot of the thing about you must wait your turn to have your voice. And so I hope that we'll retain that while you know, respecting wisdom and maturity as well. So the intergenerations, I think, is the really interesting next stage.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to all of you. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank all the people who submitted great questions. A recording of this event will be available on globalnetwork.io and on the Global Network YouTube channel. I also wanted to mention, in conjunction with this event, we've conducted a Global Network Flash survey We're polling faculty around the world about forces of disruption on business and society. And you can look for the results on globalnetwork.io. Thank you again for joining us. And please join us next time on Global Network Connect.